Welcome to a world lit by lantern flame and governed by the rhythms of the sun and seasons. The world of the Amish, known to outsiders as one of serene simplicity, is built on a bedrock of faith, hard work, and the unwavering strength of community. It's a world of straight furrows, plain dress, and quiet devotion. But underneath this placid surface, in the deep soil of tradition and the whispered stories passed down through generations, lies another world, a place of shadow and fear, where the natural and supernatural bleed together. The tales you're about to hear are drawn from this hidden corner of Amish and Pennsylvania Dutch folklore. They are more than mere ghost stories told for a thrill. They are cautionary tales, born from a culture that understands the ever-present reality of evil and the fragility of the human soul. These stories serve as boundary markers for the community, reinforcing the importance of humility, faith, and obedience to the ordinal. They give shape to the formless anxieties of a bad harvest, a sudden sickness, or the darkness that waits at the edge of the woods. They remind us that not all that is plain is simple, and that even in the most peaceful pasture, a shadow can fall. So, draw your chair closer to the hearth and listen to the whispers from the hollow. The Healer and the Hexe. The dust of late summer in Bethel's Hollow was golden and thick, settling on broad-brimmed hats and the glossy backs of horses with equal indifference. In this quiet fold of the earth, life flowed with the certainty of the seasons, governed by faith, community, and the steady rhythm of hard work. At the heart of this rhythm was Susanna Miller. Her hands, though stained with the earth from her medicinal garden, were seen as instruments of God's own mercy. When a child's fever spiked or a cow went off its feed, it was Susanna they sent for. Her poultices were said to draw out infection like a prayer, her herbal teas to soothe a troubled spirit as much as a troubled stomach. She was a pillar of Bethel's Hollow, her kindness as reliable as the morning sun. On the other side of the hollow, where the woods grew dark and tangled, lived Morwen, a woman who was Susanna's opposite in every way. Her cabin leaned as if weary of life, smoke curling from its chimney in a gray, questioning wisp. The community saw her not as a pillar, but as a splinter. Children were told not to wander near her land, and the adults spoke her name in hushed tones, often followed by a whispered German word, hexe, a witch. She was a recluse, her face a road map of sorrows, her eyes holding a knowledge that made folks uneasy. The trouble began subtly, a discordant note in the valley's peaceful hymn. It started with Bishop Klein's prize-winning milking cow. The animal, usually a picture of robust health, grew listless. Its coat lost its sheen, its great brown eyes dulled, and it refused all food. The bishop, a practical man, tried all the usual remedies before finally sending for Susanna. Susanna arrived with her familiar basket of herbs and a quiet, confident smile. She examined the cow, her touch gentle, her voice a low murmur of comfort. She prepared a mash of comfrey and nettle, but the cow turned its head away. For 3 days, Susanna worked, her brow furrowed with concern. On the 4th morning, the cow was dead. A shadow of unease fell over the community. Susanna's remedies had never failed so completely. Within a week, the unease had curdled into fear. 2 more cows in a neighboring pasture fell ill with the same wasting sickness. Then it jumped from the barns to the houses. Young Eli Yoder, who had been hale and hearty, was struck with a fever that left him pale and weak, sleeping 16 hours a day. Soon, 3 other children were afflicted with the same unnatural lethargy. The doctor from the English world came, spoke of viruses and fatigue, and left them with useless advice and a hefty bill. This was not an English sickness. This was something older, something that felt like a curse. Eyes, once filled with neighborly trust, now darted with suspicion, and that suspicion found a natural target. It settled on the leaning cabin in the dark woods. It settled on Morwen. Jacob Stolfus swore he'd seen her silhouette near the bishop's pasture the very night the first cow took ill, a hunched shape moving against the moonlight. The story spread like wildfire in dry grass. The hexe was jealous of their prosperity, of their peace. She was draining the life from their livestock and their children. Led by Bishop Klein, a grim-faced delegation of 4 men made their way to Morwen's cabin. They found her outside, digging for roots near a gnarled oak. She looked up as they approached, her eyes holding no surprise, only a deep, ancient weariness. "We've come to tell you to stop this," the bishop said, his voice tight with a father's fear. His own daughter, little Sarah, had been feverish since dawn. Morwen rose slowly, brushing dirt from her patched apron. "Stop what?" she rasped, her voice dry as autumn leaves. "Stop the withering? You look in the wrong place." She raised a trembling, soil-caked finger, but she did not point at them. She pointed past them, across the hollow, in the direction of Susanna Miller's neat, prosperous farm with its flourishing garden. "You cannot drain the well to water a single perfect rose," she croaked. "The roots will drink everything dry." The men exchanged glances. The old woman was mad. Her words were the spiteful, nonsensical ramblings of a cornered witch. They warned her that if the sickness did not end, their next visit would not be so peaceful. They left her standing there, a lonely, defiant figure against the encroaching woods. Meanwhile, Susanna was a portrait of saintly devotion. She moved from house to house, her presence a calming balm. She sat by the bedsides of the sick children, wiping their brows with lavender water, forcing spoonfuls of nourishing broth past their listless lips, and leading their worried parents in prayer. Yet, as the life seemed to drain from the children, it seemed to pour into Susanna. While the faces of other mothers and fathers grew gaunt with worry, Susanna's cheeks held a healthy, rosy bloom. Her energy was boundless, her step light. It was, the community thought, a sign of her unshakable faith, a gift from God to sustain her in this time of trial. The bishop's daughter, Sarah, grew worse. The wasting sickness gripped her more fiercely than any of the others. One night, as the child's breathing grew shallow, the bishop's wife, Anna, was seized by a desperate, unthinkable idea. While her husband sat in the parlor, his head in his hands, Anna slipped out of the house and ran, heedless of the dark, toward Morwen's cabin. She found Morwen sitting by her hearth, stirring a pot that smelled of pine and damp earth. "Help me," Anna sobbed, the words torn from her. "My Sarah is dying." Morwen looked at her, and for the first time, Alice saw not malice in the old woman's eyes, but a profound, shared grief. "The one you call a healer has touched her," Morwen stated. It was not a question. "She has given her a gift, a pretty word, a sweet drink." She beckoned Anna to a rough-hewn table. On it lay a collection of small, twisted objects. Corn-husk dolls with bits of yarn for hair, a bundle of feathers tied with a strand of horsehair, a small pouch of dried leaves and pebbles. "I've been finding these," Morwen whispered, her voice losing its rasp, becoming something stronger, "buried near the doorsteps of the sick. This is not hexe work. This is brochure, the dark kind. Sympathetic magic. It doesn't curse. It takes. It pulls the life from one place and sends it to another." The terrible truth of it settled on Anna with the weight of a burial shroud. Susanna's constant presence, her gentle touches, her gifts of blessed tea and sweet cakes, her access to every home, every child, every animal, given freely and with gratitude. Morwen's cryptic warning suddenly made horrifying sense. "We must find the heart of it," Morwen said, her voice urgent. "It will be at her home. It will be something she has made, something that holds all the stolen life." Under the sliver of a waning moon, the 2 women crept onto Susanna's property. The house was dark, but the garden beside it was unnaturally vibrant, its blossoms glowing with an almost phosphorescent light. They didn't enter the house, but went straight to the root cellar, its stone door nestled in the side of a small hill. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of damp earth and something else, something cloyingly sweet and alive. Morwen felt along the stone walls until one shifted under her touch. Prying it loose, she reached into the dark cavity behind it. She pulled out a large, masterfully woven doll. It was made of corn husk, animal fur, and woven through it were locks of familiar hair, the flaxen gold of Eli Yoder, the deep brown of a neighbor's prized heifer, and, to Anna's horror, a small, bright red curl from her own daughter, Sarah. At the center of the grotesque effigy, nestled in a bed of wool, was a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird, and it was pulsing with a faint, sickly, internal light. Without a word, Anna seized the doll. They took it to the middle of the yard, and Morwen, using a flint and steel, set it ablaze. As the flames consumed the fetish, a sound like a long collective sigh seemed to sweep through Bethel's hollow. The carved bird at the center of the fire gave a final, brilliant pulse, and then crumbled into ash. And at that very moment, in the community meeting house, Susanna Miller was on her knees, leading a fervent prayer service for the sick. Suddenly, she cried out and collapsed to the floor. When they rushed to her side, the vibrant, rosy-cheeked woman was gone. In her place was a withered, ancient-looking crone, her skin like parchment, her breath a shallow rattle. The stolen vitality had vanished, leaving behind only the true, empty vessel. The next morning, every sick child in the valley awoke, their fevers broken. The wasting sickness was gone. Susanna, her dark power shattered, was confined to her home, shunned and cared for from a distance, a living ghost haunting the community she had fed upon. Morwen, the feared hexe, slowly, cautiously became their healer. Her true knowledge of wards and remedies finally understood, and the people of Bethel's Hollow learned a harsh and lasting lesson, that evil does not always live in the shadows, but can sometimes be found in the brightest light, smiling with a smile of a friend. The Lantern in the Mist. Now, the old folks said the mist along the Pequot Creek had a memory. On nights when the air grew heavy and damp, swallowing the moonlight and muffling the world, it would rise from the water not as simple fog, but as a shroud. And within that shroud, some said, a light would appear. A single lantern, its flame a warm, steady glow, bobbing gently as if held by a steady, unseen hand. They called it the traveler's light, a ghostly guide for those who had lost their way in the blinding white. Some tales claimed it led the lost back to safety of the Lancaster Pike. Others were darker, whispered only when the children were in bed, tales of a light that would lead to places from which no one returned. Amos Miller was not a man for such stories. At 20 years old, he was strong, practical, and possessed a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He believed in the solid earth under his feet, the strength of his own two hands, and the Word of God. Ghosts and phantom lights were English nonsense, fanciful tales to scare the gullible. His path was straight and true, and he would not be turned from it by shadows. This confidence was in his heart as he guided his horse and buggy home one starless autumn evening. He had been visiting Rebecca Fisher, whose father's farm was a good 2 hours away. The visit had gone well. Rebecca's shy smiles and the approving nod of her father had made the journey worthwhile. The air was still and cool when he left, but as he neared the low-lying lands by the creek, a change occurred. A wall of white, thick and sudden as a slammed door, rolled in from the water. One moment, Amos could see the familiar silhouettes of the sycamores lining the road. The next, he could see nothing but the ears of his own horse, and even those were hazy outlines. The fog was unnaturally dense, a wet, clinging blanket that deadened all sound. The familiar clip-clop of his horse's hooves became a dull, muffled thud. Amos slowed the animal to a walk, his knuckles white on the reins. He knew this road like the back of his hand, yet in this disorienting vapor, every bend and rise felt alien. After what felt like an hour, a cold knot of uncertainty began to tighten in his stomach. Surely he should have passed the old covered bridge by now. He should have been on the upward slope toward his family's land. Frustration pricked at him. He clicked his tongue, urging the horse forward, but the animal was skittish, its ears twitching nervously. It was then that he saw it. Through a momentary thinning of the mist, a point of light appeared. It was faint at first, a distant spark, but it grew steadily into the clear, warm glow of a lantern with a well-trimmed wick. It hovered perhaps 100 yards off the road to his left, bobbing with a gentle, rhythmic motion. Amos felt a surge of relief. It must be old man Esh, he reasoned, checking out his fences. Or perhaps another traveler who, like him, had been caught in the sudden fog. "Hello," Amos called out, his voice sounding strangely flat in the thick air. "Are you heading for the pike?" There was no reply. The lantern simply continued its gentle, silent dance. A flicker of the old tales passed through his mind, but he angrily pushed it away. This was reality, not a ghost story. A light meant a person, and a person meant a way out of this damnable fog. With a firm tug on the reins, he guided his horse off the packed dirt of the road and onto the softer earth of the pasture, heading towards the light. The ground was soft under the buggy's wheels. At first, the going was easy. The lantern held its distance, a perfect, unwavering beacon in the white chaos. Amos kept his eyes fixed on it, a golden promise of direction. He felt a sense of gratitude swell within him. He would have to thank whoever it was, share a warm drink with them when they reached the road. But they did not reach the road. The ground grew softer still, the wheels sinking into wet soil that squelched and sucked with every turn. The air grew colder, carrying the smell of decay and stagnant water. The familiar scent of hay and farmland was gone, replaced by the damp, primordial odor of the swamp that bordered the creek, a place everyone knew to avoid. Amos pulled back on the reins, his heart starting to hammer in his chest. This wasn't right. The lantern had led him away from the road, not towards it. He tried to turn the horse, but the animal resisted, its eyes wide with terror, fixed on the light. And Amos felt it too, a strange, compelling pull. The lantern's glow was no longer just a light, it was a destination. It was the only thing that existed in this white, silent world. Turning back meant plunging into absolute, featureless blackness. The thought was terrifying. The light, deceptive as it might be, was at least something to see. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracky with a fear he now could not deny. "This is not a game." The only answer was the silent bobbing of the flame. It began to move again, leading him deeper into the swamp. Skeletal, leafless trees draped in moss loomed out of the mist like bony specters. The buggy lurched as a wheel sank into a hidden hole, the axle groaning in protest. Amos knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was being led to his doom. The traveler's light was not a guide, it was a lure. With a cry of desperation, he yanked the reins hard, forcing the terrified horse into a sharp turn. He would face the darkness, the nothingness, rather than follow that accursed light another step. But as he turned, the fog behind him seemed to thicken, to become a solid, impenetrable wall. There was no path back. There was only the swamp ahead, and the lantern, which had now stopped. It hung perfectly still over a patch of ground that seemed darker than the rest, its golden light reflected in the slick black surface of a hidden pool. A sinkhole! The realization hit Amos with the force of a physical blow. The lantern had brought him to the edge of a sinkhole, a place where the earth could swallow a horse and buggy whole, leaving no trace. He stared, mesmerized by the hypnotic flame. It seemed to pulse, to brighten, beckoning him forward. He felt his will dissolving, his terror replaced by a strange, empty calm. It would be so easy to just let the horse take one more step. A sudden, sharp crack broke the spell. A dead branch, heavy with moisture, fell from a nearby tree, startling the horse. The animal reared, whinnying in sheer panic. The buggy lurched violently, and Amos was thrown from his seat. He landed hard in the cold, sucking mud, his hat flying from his head. Scrambling to his feet, he saw the horse, wild-eyed, fighting the reins and dragging the buggy away from the sinkhole, back in the direction they had come from, disappearing into the fog. Amos was alone with the light. He turned to face it. The lantern hung there, silent, patient, its job almost done. He took a step back, his boot sinking deep into the mire. He took another step, fighting the pull of the mud. He would not die here. He turned his back on the light and stumbled through the darkness, hands outstretched, praying that he was heading away from the water, away from the treacherous ground. He fell, rose, and fell again, his clothes torn, his body bruised, driven by a primal need to escape that silent, watchful glow. The next day, when Amos had not returned, a search party was formed. They found the horse and buggy first, tangled in the thicket a mile from the road, the animal trembling but unharmed. They followed the deep gouged tracks of the buggy wheels back into the swamp, their faces grim. They called his name until they were hoarse, the sound swallowed by the lingering mist. It was his own father who found it. As dusk began to settle, painting the swamp in shades of gray and purple, he saw a familiar shape lying on a patch of moss at the edge of a dark, still sinkhole. It was Amos's black felt hat. As the men gathered around, their faces etched with grief, a single point of light ignited in the mist hanging just over the water's surface. It glowed with a soft, steady, golden flame for a long moment, as if in quiet satisfaction. Then, as silently as it had appeared, it winked out, leaving them alone in the encroaching darkness. The Butcher of the Backroads. In Lancaster County, where humility is stitched into the very fabric of life, Levi Zook was a man of jarringly vibrant color. By trade, he was a butcher, and by reputation, he was the best. His hogs were unnaturally large and fat, their meat so marbled and flavorful that English buyers from Philadelphia would make the long journey to his farm, their wallets full. Levi's smokehouse was like a temple of cured meats, and his stall at the market was an altar upon which his pride was displayed every Tuesday and Friday. His neighbors watched him with a mixture of envy and unease. They saw the pride in the way he stood, the dismissive wave of his hand when asked his secrets, the smug smile that played on his lips as he weighed out a pound of bacon that was worth more than their entire morning's sales. Such pride was a dangerous thing, a crack in the vessel of a righteous life. It invited darkness. The elders would shake their heads and murmur, "A haughty spirit goeth before a fall." But Levi's success only grew, and his spirit became haughtier with every dollar he earned. But his secret was not in his feed, nor in some special breed of hog. His secret was bound in cracked leather and kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his butchering shed. It was a book, its pages yellow and brittle, filled with spidery German script. It was a book of brochure, witchcraft, but not the kind of folk magic used to charm away warts or soothe a colicky baby. This was a darker text, one that spoke of pacts and power, of drawing fortune from the misfortune of others, of bending the natural world to one's will through sacrifice and shadow work. Late at night, when the moon was a sliver and his wife and children were asleep, Levi would light a single tallow candle in his shed. The air would grow thick with the metallic tang of old blood and the strange peppery scent of the herbs he burned. He would chant the words from the book, his voice a low rumble that was half prayer, half command. His rituals, they were small at first. He would draw symbols on his animals' feed bins, symbols that promised unnatural growth. He would bury talismans at the four corners of his property, claiming the luck of the land for himself, leaving the soil of his neighbors just a little less fertile, their livestock just a little more prone to sickness. He saw it as simple business, a way to get ahead. He did not consider the overall cost. The breaking point came on a sweltering Tuesday at the market. Levi had brought his most prized hog, a monstrous beast of nearly 400 pounds. A crowd had gathered, marveling at its size. Samuel Fisher, a humble farmer whose own pigs were scrawny that season, stood at the edge of the crowd, his face a mask of weary admiration. "It is a blessing from God, Levi," Samuel said, his voice genuine. "You are truly favored." Levi laughed, a loud booming sound that made people flinch. "God has little to do with it, Samuel," he declared, slapping the hog's broad flank. "This is the work of a master. It takes knowledge, not just prayer. Perhaps if you spent less time on your knees and more time learning the trade, your own family wouldn't look so hungry. A shocked silence fell over the market stall. To so openly mock a neighbor's hardship, to belittle his faith, it was a transgression of the deepest kind. Samuel Fisher's face flushed with shame, and he turned away without another word. The other farmers and their wives looked at Levi with cold eyes, the last vestiges of their respect for him evaporating in the humid air. But Levi, puffed up with his own importance, didn't notice. He had asserted his dominance. He was the king of this small world, and his prized hog was his crown. That night, the weather turned. The sky, which had been clear, bruised to a deep purple gray. A wind rose, moaning through the eaves of the farmhouse and rattling the windows. Levi sat at his table, counting his day's earnings, a deep satisfaction warming him. He paid no mind to the storm. As the first few drops of rain began to fall, a strange quiet descended upon the farm. The crickets fell silent. The horses in the barn stopped shuffling. A deep, unnatural stillness settled over the land. Levi looked up from his coins, a prickle of unease on his neck. He went to the window and peered out into the darkness. He saw a figure standing at the edge of the yard, just where the light from the window faded into blackness. It was tall and impossibly thin, a silhouette cut from the deepest shadow. It wasn't a man. Its proportions were wrong, its limbs too long, its posture too rigid. It simply stood there, motionless in the wind and rain, watching the house. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced Levi's arrogant heart. He knew, with a certainty that defied logic, what this was. It was the other half of the bargain. The source of the power in his leather-bound book had come to collect its due. The book promised prosperity, but it never specified the price. He backed away from the window, his breath catching in his throat. He ran to the butchering shed, fumbling for the hidden book. He had to find a ward, a prayer of protection, something to turn it away. As he tore at the floorboard, he heard a sound that froze his blood. It was the squeal of a pig, not the normal sound of hunger or complaint, but a high, thin scream of absolute terror cut brutally short. Then another, and another. He burst from the shed into the lashing rain, a butcher's cleaver clenched in his hand. The shadowy figure was gone from the edge of the yard. It was inside the pig pen. Levi could not see it, but he could feel its presence, a pocket of absolute cold and malevolence. His prized hogs, the source of his wealth and his pride, were being slaughtered. He ran towards the pen, shouting a wordless cry of rage and terror. The next morning, Levi's wife awoke to a world washed clean by the storm. The silence from the pig pen was what she noticed first. With a growing sense of dread, she went outside. The scene that greeted her would be seared into the community's memory forever. The pen was a charnel house. Every one of Levi's hogs, including the massive prize winner, lay dead. They had not been butchered. They had been torn apart with a savage, inhuman violence. In the center of the carnage lay Levi's favorite cleaver and his blood-soaked apron, as if he had been interrupted in his work. Of Levi himself, there was no sign. The only trace was a faint, sickeningly sweet smell that clung to the air, the smell of sulfur and burnt pride. They searched for days, but Levi's look was never seen again. His farm was sold, the book of dark brochery presumably rotting beneath the floorboards of the abandoned shed. But the story did not end. It became a legend, a cautionary tale whispered on dark nights. They say Levi's spirit never left the backroads around his old farm, and they say if you travel there after dusk, you might see a tormented figure wandering the lanes, his face a mask of anguish, forever searching for the pride he sold his soul for. He is the butcher of the back roads, a ghost bound to his own arrogance, a permanent stain on the humble fabric of the land. The Child in the Corn. The farm was a bargain. That should have been the first warning. When Jacob Schultz bought the 80 acres of land nestled in a forgotten corner of the county, the price was so low it felt like a blessing. The farmhouse was solid, the barn sturdy, and the fields lay rich and dark under the sun. The only oddity was the corn. A vast 50-acre field stretched out from the back of the house, planted unnaturally close, its stalks so dense they formed a solid wall of green. The previous owner, a man who had left in a hurry, had planted it, but never stayed to see the harvest. The land has a hunger, an old neighbor had told Jacob, his eyes distant. It always takes its share. Jacob, a practical man, had simply nodded and dismissed it as the ramblings of old age. For Jacob's wife, Sarah, the farm felt different. It was isolated, and the constant soft rustling from the cornfield was a sound that set her teeth on edge. It sounded like whispers, just beyond the edge of hearing. Their 6-year-old daughter, Elsbeth, a quiet and watchful child, seemed to feel it too, but for her, the feeling was not one of dread, but of fascination. From the first week, the cornfield became Elsbeth's domain. She would stand at its edge for hours, her small form dwarfed by the towering stalks, her head cocked as if listening to a conversation no one else could hear. At first, Sarah was pleased. The child had found a way to entertain herself. Then Elsbeth began to talk about her new friend. "His name is the corn kind," she announced one evening at dinner, pushing her peas around their plate. "And who is this corn kind?" Jacob asked, smiling. "Is he from the Yoder family down the road?" Elsbeth shook her head, her expression serious. "No, Papa. He lives in the corn." Jacob and Sarah exchanged a look. An imaginary friend. It was normal for a lonely child in a new place. "Well, it's good you have a friend to play with," Sarah said, her voice gentle. But the corn kind was not like other imaginary friends. Elsbeth's descriptions were sparse and strange. He was very tall. He rustled when he moved. His hair was soft, like the silk on an ear of corn, and his skin was green and papery. The drawings she made were even more unsettling. She would draw their family, 3 stick figures under a smiling sun, and next to them, a 4th figure. It was a tall, spindly creature made of overlapping leaves and stalks, with long, thin limbs, and a round, featureless face, save for 2 dark circles for eyes. The behavior grew even stranger. Elsbeth began saving a portion of her food from every meal. She would wrap a piece of bread or a few slices of apple in a napkin and carry it outside. Sarah followed her once and watched her from the kitchen window as Elsbeth placed a small offering on a flat stone at the very edge of the cornfield, then retreated to the house. The next morning, the food would be gone. Crows, Sarah told herself, maybe raccoons. One afternoon, Sarah found Elsbeth by the corn, her hands cupped, whispering intently into the dense wall of green. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked. Elsbeth turned, her eyes wide. "I'm telling him about my blue dress. He likes blue. He says it's the color of the sky when he peeks through the leaves." A chill, unrelated to the autumn breeze, traced a path down Sarah's spine. "Can I meet him?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. Elsbeth's face fell. "Oh, no, Mama. He's very shy. He only comes out when the wind blows just right. He says grown-ups have too much noise in their heads to hear him anyway." The unease in Sarah's heart took root and began to grow. She started forbidding Elsbeth from going near the corn, a rule that turned her usually placid daughter sullen and withdrawn. The child would sit at her window, staring out the field, her expression one of deep longing. Jacob remained unconcerned. "She is a child with a strong imagination," he would say, his voice full of paternal certainty. "It is the isolation. When the harvest comes, the field will be gone, and so will this corn kind. You will see." The harvest came in late October. The roar of the hired harvester was a brutal intrusion into the valley's quiet. Day by day, the machine chewed its way through the rows, leaving behind a wake of shredded stalks and bare earth. And with every row that fell, Elsbeth's anxiety grew into a palpable terror. She refused to eat. She had terrible nightmares, waking the house with her screams. You're hurting him, she would cry, her small body trembling. The iron teeth are cutting him down. He's angry. Jacob, his patience now worn thin, tried to reason with her. Elsbeth, it is just corn. It is our crop. This is how we live. He gave us the crop, she shrieked, her face pale and tear-streaked. He made it grow strong for us. It's part of him. You can't take it all. On the final day of the harvest, a heavy silence fell over the breakfast table. Elsbeth was unnervingly calm. She ate her oatmeal without a word, her eyes fixed on the window. Outside, a small, stubborn patch of corn remained, a small island of green in a sea of brown, tilled earth. It stood directly behind the house, perhaps 20 rows deep. The harvester was scheduled to finish the job before noon. Sarah, her nerves frayed, was grateful for the quiet. She got busy with her morning chores, canning the last of the tomatoes, the rhythmic pop of the sealing jars a comforting domestic sound. For a half hour, the house was peaceful. It was the silence that finally alerted her, the unnatural silence of a house with a child in it. Elsbeth, she called out, wiping her hands on her apron. No answer. Elsbeth! She searched the house, her crawls growing more frantic. The child's room was empty, her small bed neatly made. A cold dread washed over Sarah as she ran to the back door. It was slightly ajar. Outside, the world was still. The harvester sat silent at the far end of the field, the driver waiting for Jacob's signal. The only thing that moved was the last patch of corn, its leaves rustling in the breeze, sounding more than ever like whispers. Jacob! Her scream was raw, tearing through the quiet air. He came running from the barn, his face a question that turned to fear when he saw hers. They searched, their voices rising in panic, calling Elsbeth's name over and over and over. They circled the small island of corn, peering into its dark, claustrophobic depths. The stalks were so thick, the leaves so dense, that after a few feet, the light from the outside world was gone. They searched until the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and blood. The community came, neighbors forming a human chain, sweeping the bare fields, their lanterns bobbing in the twilight. But they all avoided the final patch of corn, as if by unspoken agreement. It was Jacob who finally found it. As the last light faded, he stood at the edge of the remaining rows, his shoulders slumped in defeat. His gaze fell upon the tilled earth at his feet. There, lying there, stark against the dark soil, was a small object. A small, blue cloth bonnet. He picked it up, his large, calloused hands trembling. He turned it over and over, as if it held an answer. He looked into the wall of corn before him. The rustling had stopped. The field was utterly silent, as if holding its breath. It had been fed. The land had taken its share. Of Elsbeth, there was no other trace, and the whispers on the wind were silent at last. The nachtkrapp's shadow. The story of the nachtkrapp was the toiling bell that ended every childhood day in our house. As the sun bled out behind the hills and the shadows in the corners of the room deepened, my mother or father would invoke its name. The night raven, they called it, a monstrous, bird-like creature with wings of leather and eyes like dull coals. They said it flew on silent wings through the darkness, searching for children who were not in their beds. It would snatch them up in its great, cruel beak and carry them away in a basket woven from the bones of other disobedient children, never to be seen again. For my younger brother, Samuel, this was a terrifying reality. At 6 years old, his world was one of literal belief. The nachtkrapp was as real to him as the horses in our barn or the bread on our table. Every evening, he would scramble into his bed, pulling the quilt up to his chin, his eyes wide until sleep finally claimed him. For me, at 12, it was just a story, a tool, a foolish piece of folklore used to enforce bedtime. I was a boy of logic and burgeoning pride. I believed in the solid world I could see and touch, a world that had no room for giant, child-stealing ravens. I saw Samuel's fear, not with sympathy, but with a growing impatience. It was a weakness, a childishness I felt I had long outgrown. Samuel, there's no such thing as a nachtkrapp, I told him one night, my voice filled with the condescending authority of an older brother. We were in our shared room, the lamplight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Samuel shook his head from under his quilt, his blond hair sticking out. Papa says there is. He says it takes the bad ones. And you believe him? I scoffed. It's just a story, Samuel, to make you go to sleep. There's nothing out there but owls and moths. It's real, he insisted, his voice a small, trembling whisper. I hear its wings sometimes. That was the moment the idea, sharp and cruel, took root in my mind. I would prove it to him. I would shatter this foolish fear and, in doing so, confirm my own superior understanding of the world. All right, I said, leaning closer, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. If you're so sure, let's go and see it. Let's prove it. We'll sneak out to the barn tonight. We'll wait and watch. When nothing happens, you'll see I'm right, and you can stop being a baby about it. Terror warred with adoration in his wide blue eyes. The thought of deliberately putting himself in the path of the nachtkrapp was horrifying, but the thought of disappointing me, his older brother whom he idolized, was almost as bad. We'll get in trouble, he whispered. Only if we get caught, I countered. Are you a man or a mouse, Samuel? That was the final hook. He nodded slowly, a single terrified jerk of his head. We waited until the house fell into the deep, rhythmic silence of sleep, marked only by the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. I slid out of bed, my bare feet cold on the wooden floorboards. Samuel followed, a small, trembling shadow in his nightshirt. Every creak of the floor seemed like a cannon shot. The familiar landscape of our home had transformed into a hostile territory filled with unseen dangers. I felt a flicker of my own nervousness, but pushed it down, replacing it with a mask of bravado for Samuel's sake. The night air was cool and smelled of damp earth and cut hay. The moon was nearly full, bathing the yard in a pale, silvery light that made everything look strange and unreal. The barn loomed before us, a great dark mountain against the star-dusted sky. I led the way, my hand on Samuel's shoulder, and we slipped through the side door, the familiar scent of animals and dust enveloping us. See, I whispered, my voice echoing slightly in the vast quiet space. Nothing here, just the cows and the horses. I led him up the ladder to the hayloft. From the high window, we had a perfect view of the entire farmyard, the fields, and the dark line of the woods beyond. We settled into the hay, the scratchy stalks, a familiar comfort. For a long time, nothing happened. An owl hooted from a distant tree. Cows shuffled and sighed below us. I felt a smug satisfaction growing. I was right. It was all just a silly story. I want to go back, Jacob, Samuel whispered, his teeth chattering. Just a little longer, I insisted. The real dark hasn't even started yet. And as if my words were a cue, the night seemed to change. It was a subtle shift, but undeniable. The friendly sounds of the farm seemed to die away one by one. The crickets fell silent. The owl stopped hooting. A profound, listening stillness settled over the land, so deep it felt like the world was holding its breath. Even the moonlight seemed to lose its warmth, becoming a cold, sterile silver. The prickle of unease I'd been suppressing returned, stronger this time. And that's when we heard it. It was not the sound of a bird. It was a dry, rhythmic whoop, whoop, whoop sound, like a giant leather blanket being beaten against the air. It was high above us, a sound so vast it seemed to press down on the roof of the barn. Samuel grabbed my arm, his small fingers digging into my flesh like tiny claws. Jacob, he breathed, the word a tiny puff of terror. I was frozen. My smug confidence instantly evaporated and was replaced by a primal fear I'd never known. I wanted to tell him it was the wind, but the air was perfectly still. I wanted to say it was a train off in the distance, but it was a living, rhythmic sound. Then the shadow came. It fell over the moonlit yard, a patch of absolute blackness that moved with an unnatural speed. It was immense, larger than the barn itself, blotting out the stars as it passed. My heart beating inside my chest, a frantic drum against the silent night. I forced myself to look up, to peer through the hayloft window. What I saw would be burned into my memory for the rest of my life. Against the pale glow of the moon was a silhouette. It was a bird, but a bird of impossible scale. Its wingspan stretched from one side of the yard to the other, each wing beat a slow, powerful stroke that stirred the very air. It had the shape of a raven, but magnified to a monstrous size, with a long, cruelly hooked beak, and clutched in its massive talons was a shape, a large, sagging basket, or maybe a sack that swayed with the creature's movement, the nachtkrapp. It was real. A sound tore from Samuel's throat. It was not a cry or a word, but a single high-pitched shriek of pure, unadulterated terror that cut through the night's silence. The great shadow paused in its flight. The rhythmic wing beats stopped. The colossal head, larger than a horse's, turned slowly, deliberately towards the barn, towards our window. For one horrifying second, I saw 2 points of dull red light fix upon us, eyes that held a cold, ancient, and hungry intelligence. The sight broke my paralysis. A surge of adrenaline, of pure protective terror for my little brother, flooded through me. I grabbed Samuel by the front of his nightshirt and yanked him back from the window, pulling him deep into the fragrant darkness of the hay. He fell against me, his small body rigid and trembling, but he made no other sound. We huddled there, buried in the hay, as the great shadow passed over the barn, and the sound of those terrible leathery wings faded off into the distance. We did not move a muscle until the first pale fingers of dawn crept through the cracks in the barn walls. I led my brother back to the house, my own body shaking with a cold that had nothing to do with the crisp morning air. He was pliant, his hand limp in mine. He did not speak. And he never spoke again. From that day forward, little Samuel was mute. The boy who had been full of questions and stories was trapped in a silent world, his blue eyes forever wide with a terror he could not name. He became terrified of the dark, of open windows, of the sound of wings, even of sparrows. I'd set out to prove a story was false, to cure a childish fear. Instead, I'd shattered my brother's mind and discovered a truth far more terrible than any story. The guilt is a weight I carry forever, as real and as heavy as the memory of that shadow we saw that night against the moon. Now the fire dies down and the stories are told. A spectral farmer toils for eternity, and a child is lost to the whispers of the corn. These tales, born of Amish and of Pennsylvania Dutch soil, leave a chill that lingers long after the final word. They're unsettling, to be sure, but their purpose is not merely to frighten, it is to instruct. Each story is a nail driven into the framework of the community, securing a belief or a value. The nachtkrapp is not just a monster. It is the personification of the danger that await those who stray from the safety of home and family after dark. The healer and the hexe remind us that evil can wear the face of piety, and that true goodness may be found where we least expect it. Ultimately, these tales serve as a powerful reminder that in a world governed by faith, the struggle between good and evil is not an abstract concept, but a daily reality. They acknowledge the darkness so that the light may seem brighter, and they map the boundaries of fear so that the community may know where it is safe. They are the echoes of a people who understand that the straight path is narrow, and that for those who wander from it, there are far worse things than simple loneliness waiting in the gloom.